Okay, I'm here with my good friend Stephen Lewis. Stephen Lewis likes to think about things. In fact, I don't know another guy who thinks so much about so many things. Almost, I know a couple guys. I know
I
a
mean, that
couple
goes there.
people in the world who really think, and you're one of them. So,
I kind of landed on a Jewish interpretation of Christianity. I think one of the reasons was a Jewish interpretation of René Girard, that is. And one of the reasons was I was fascinated, I was obsessed with uh, anti-Semitism and trying to resolve that problem in the context of Christianity. And so I was kind of working on that in my head for a long time. And it seems to me that René Girard uh, developed a theory which completely reconciled Christianity and Judaism. This was kind of my Jewish moment, even though it was from reading a Christian thinker. And the Jewish moment is what René Girard claims to be the absolute. René Girard claims that he articulated the absolute, which is a very strong statement, and you knew he was making a very strong statement. And the way he states that in his writing is done in a very tricky way. He comes out in this big blasting surprise to say, "Yes, guess what this is? It's the absolute. This is actually what it is." And the absolute is one simple phrase. It's the defense of the innocent victim. That's what the absolute is.
hmm.
And there's a long theory. There's an elaborate theory he develops before he leads the reader to that moment. And it's a theory that he developed, I think, in the 1960s. He said it took him a long time to figure out how he was going to articulate it. He took years to figure out how he was going to say it, but he understood the theory a long time before. So it was the 1970s that he broke that theory, in the early 70s. And for me, it was a very big deal. I mean, to me, he may be the most important theorist, period. It's such, because he identifies so many things. He identifies, at least he claims to, and what he thinks is the foundation of human culture. And it more or less, it's the moment, a recurring moment that happened millions and millions of times. And in way back in prehistory mostly, but also continuing into history and progressively diminishing, where we slowly created a social construct which separated us from our animal origins. It created a social superimposition upon our biological beings. And it was a very, very dark thing, what happened. But nonetheless, it is the raw material with which we construct society and culture today.
Can I stop you for a second? Because I just
Yeah,
had a thought. Is that the
yeah.
story of Cain and Abel, right? Which is the story of the
It's
first people? Yeah.
it's totally related to Cain and Abel. It's closer to Abraham, the story of Abraham and Isaac, than the story of Cain and Abel. But it's all related. Like the Bible, the Judaism is totally obsessed with this, uh, and it's obsessed with this dark, this very, this thing that this dark feature of the human experience, which we absolutely have to control. We can't let it control us. We have to rein it in and contain it. And if we don't, it controls us. And this controlling force is a recurring, for René Girard, is a recurring force of collective murder, a recurring pattern of collective murder, mostly featured in deep prehistory, progressively diminishing as history advances. So there's a slow process of becoming aware of this. And he says the Bible does this better than any other cultural focus.
So that's the story of human sacrifice, and
Correct.
which means a bunch of people gathering around the weakest, most innocent person and making them redundant, blaming them for whatever happened, or because they're weak, or and can't keep the tribe going, or
First of all, human sacrifice is a big fat lie. The whole term human sacrifice is a term that's used. It's an older term, and it refers to it represents something that is not understood. But there is the observation that a human is being killed by a group, and then there's, since it's often coded in elements of religiosity, therefore it's called human sacrifice. René Girard points out that this is actually a deeply entrenched cultural mechanism of a culture lying to itself about what's actually happening. So there's this. He basically says that culture is founded on the dark recurring moment of cultural murder, in collective murder, in which we lie about what happened. So here's basically, he says that we are very imitative animals. We engage in, we're completely predisposed to imitate each other, but this is in many ways totally irrational. In some, it's kind of a synonym of desire, and in a sense, as a result, it's an illusion of desire at the same time. It's just simply imitating another is what he seems to be saying desire is. I don't like the way he. I think I have a problem with his definition of desire, but nonetheless, he's talking about this great force of imitation, and what happens is one imitates another, and then another imitates, and then what you have is this whole group imitating the same pattern of behavior, and there tends to be a rivalry with it, and that's probably why the term desire matters for Girard, because what happens is one tries to outdo the other in imitating the exact same pattern of imitative behavior, and what you have is this snowballing effect of collective imitation. And what the problem with that is, it's totally irrational for one, and it's resolving nothing, and it's escalating into pandemonious violence, because there's this intense rivalry about something which is totally irrational, and all it is an imitative pattern of behavior. And what happened, and it's something that it seems it's spontaneously happened, and doesn't how and why this worked is utterly mysterious. But basically, in that great snowballing of mimetic desire, there would be a sense that things were about to erupt into uncontrolled mass violence. And someone in the group, and this would be a relatively small tribal group all the same, someone in the group would spontaneously say, it's his fault or it's her fault. And it was usually someone who was unable to follow the imitative patterns, didn't have the capacity, was either mentally delayed or physically deformed, or in some way didn't have the capacity to follow these patterns of imitation. And because they weren't following it, then they were the oddballs out of the whole snowballing process. Mm-hmm. That person was spontaneously accused of being the one who caused this entire pandemonium. And the collective group would in turn all spontaneously, in the same wave of imitative fervor, would agree. Mm-hmm. Absolutely everybody in the group would be wrapped up in this imitative pattern, except those who did not have the capacity.
They would spontaneously agree to choose a representative scapegoat.
Correct. And it was basically totally irrational. And then they would in turn, so that was, the accusation first came, and then the agreement, the unanimous agreement from the entire group was the trial, basically. And so the verdict was immediate, and everybody agreed. In other words, there was a judge, and that was the accuser, and then there was a jury who all immediately agreed. And I'm only saying this, we're only superimposing a much later form of justice, which is the court of law, onto. But this is ancient prehistory, and then they would in turn kill the person. They would. Okay.
Just a question: how is that different from how animals behave? Like an animal, animals would
Animals don't
an
practice.
animal might get rid of the weakest person, right? Or because the weakest person might be a drain on the resources of the
An
pack.
animal might get rid of the weakest animal. I don't know if that's the case. I think humans are unique in practicing this in this particular practice. I don't think it's a.
Are
I
they
don't think it exists.
unique? Are they unique in their scale, or are they actually unique in
That's a good question. I mean, it's a very good question. But I have heard that humans are unique in this. I don't, whether other animals practice bizarre things where members of the group get
Well,
killed. A single member of the group gets killed by the entire group. I don't know if that's.
I think what's unique about humans is they have idols, they make representations. That's what's
Okay.
unique about our brain, for
Yeah.
example.
Well, I haven't got that. So that's the first. So I haven't gotten to that part. I'm getting there. So
Okay.
that's the first part. Well, so the group, the tribe, the group has just killed someone, killed a scapegoat. And what happens in that moment is the whole group calms down. And so and how and why this calming occurs because someone was just killed is utterly strange and mysterious. But nonetheless, this is what happened. It happened over and over and over and over again. And so the act of killing someone accused of the uncontrolled mimetic patterns was a deep unconscious mechanism which succeeded in calming down the entire tribe. They would all stop, and for a time, the rivalry and the mimetic snowballing would disappear completely,
Mm-hmm.
and so a temporary peace would reign over the group. And this discovery became something that was worshipped. Girard theorizes that what they did was they began to deify the person who was just killed because the person had brought peace to the tribe. And so, in other words, it was meant to be. And so what in turn actually happened was they would then in turn worship the person who had just killed as a god because that person had brought peace upon the tribe. And they would do this for a time. They would do this for a time until that particular god had faded from memory, essentially, which might happen. You can imagine. You can only imagine how long that would be. And so, this cycle of mimeticism would return and another snowballing, and it would usually involve a different pattern of behavior. The last time they were, who knows, maybe they were they were discussing rocks, and so the next thing they'd be having a fight about rocks, and then it would escalate into this grand tribal crazy pandemonium about rocks, and then they kill someone, and then they would deify the person killed. The person killed, in turn deified, would be associated with the fight over rocks that they had just had. Mm-hmm. And the next time it would be about trees, or next time it would be about sky, next time it would be about clothes or beauty or all kinds of basically.
It sounds like the beginning of some kind of narrative of the tribe, right?
Well, basically the filling in of every shade of meaning involved a tremendous a snowballing, tremendous internal mimetic struggle, which was resolved by killing someone, in turn worshipped. And then what would happen was a peace invested, a false sense of peace invested in whatever they were fighting about, whether it was a key or a thumb. So, thumbs, who's got the biggest thumb or whatever. And each and every time that happened, it would add, and the worshiping of the killed person would invest language into the mimeticized piece of mimeticism is Girard's term, which means increasingly uncontrolled imitative behavior, which snowballs and spins out of control. That's what he means by mimeticism. And so basically, this was a extremely long process, which he speculates may have been hundreds of thousands of years, where each and every shade of nuance of meaning actually, and the worshiping of the person killed involved an investment of language. It would involve a deification of a given piece of language would emerge out of that, from deifying the piece invested, the sense of false peace derived from that repeated experience of killing someone. I don't know if you're getting it. It's a difficult thing to explain.
Yes, it's fine. It means that, so you have an innocent victim and the whole tribe is brought into this frenzy, and they kill the innocent victim, and then there's a period of appeasement because they've made the sacrifice, which lasts for a certain time until the tension builds up again and again, and there's some other issue, and then they find another victim, and each time they're creating the story of themselves, in a sense.
Okay, you're getting most of it, but what I'm trying to get at here is the creation of language.
Yeah, the story.
With each, it seems to me that they maybe the persons killed had names or something, but there would be an utterance. Going way back in time, it might be, and so at first the person killed would be, but then later they began to distinguish from and then they would and each person killed would have a distinguishing sound, and over time this would develop. They would bring together different sounds, and then it would become bid and bad and bud and rock and rack and ski, ska, sky, and so associated with whatever they were imitating, whatever they were fighting about. So whatever they were pointing to and competing over would then be invested in a certain sound, which eventually became the syllabic substructure of our language. Basically, I think Girard thinks that, which is a damn radical bloody theory. It's a major goddamn theory. And
so each part of our language is a result. I'm not sure if I'm getting it of some scapegoat.
He thinks our linguistic substrata is basically composed is a deep, muddy compost of murders. Basically, each and every one of them, and we started to create compound. We became creative with it once the compost was there. We could do stuff with it, and that became, we started to develop other ways of doing things. But basically, there's a and the thing about it, they would kill someone, and then they would deify that person, saying this was meant to be, and they would deify the person killed. But it was all a big fat lie. All it was a murderous, just a murder, and it happened to resolve. It happened to calm people down. And so, in other words, our syllabic substructure, the substrata of human language, and this is every tribe without exception, says Girard, all around the world. The substrata of human language is based on one nugget after another of human hypocrisy. Basically, each and every syllable is born from a hypocritical moment in which the whole tribe killed someone and then lied to themselves about where it really happened.
Very dark theory.
Yeah, it's dark for sure. But he also says, and in other words, there's a deep sense of blame, an extremely profound sense of blame rooted in but it's also a concealment of. There's also an illusion of peace or something like that. And not only that, this affects our sense of other tribes, of other cultures, because we have this immediate sense of we don't see it in ourselves, but we see it in them, that they're a bunch of violent savages. we sense the hypocrisy in their language and stuff, but we don't see it in ourselves. We see it in them. It's easier to see the other side. It's easier to see the hypocrisy.
Right, the way you don't see your own back.
Yeah. And so basically, I think this theory, it just explains everything. Now, Girard is a Christian. He believes in God, and the reason he is this, and he's also claims that the Jewish Bible presents a full account, although in a disparate form. It's spread out in bits and pieces in different parts of the Bible. You have to piece it together yourself to show how the Jewish Bible explains, actually has a full explanation for this. He says the Christian Testament has a more concentrated, more explicit, in your face, totally in your face explanation, especially in the Gospels of this particular occurrence.
Okay.
And
so it's already there in Cain and Abel and Abraham and Job.
It's definitely there.
But it doesn't come into fruition until, it's most obvious. The most obvious sacrifice is of Jesus, right? That's the most.
It's most obviously in the Jewish Testament in the book of Isaiah, and he gives about 10 or 20 citations for us to look at in Isaiah. It's actually quite shocking. It's quite amazing what it says in Isaiah about the killing of innocents and how they're used as scapegoats and it's all this kind of stuff. His point is this is deeply unconscious. That's Girard's point. It is so unconscious that it is, even though it is expressed in a totally explicit form, he illustrates that it is very explicit. It's very explicitly stated in the Gospels. It has only been transformed into a rational theory in the 20th century. He says he's the second. The very first, it's kind of fascinating. He says the very first was Nietzsche, but Nietzsche didn't even, it seems like he didn't even know he did it or something. But he identifies an aphorism in the Will to Power where he says, this is in his, one of his last books. It might be his last book, actually. It's called I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, René Girard's last book. It was published in 2000. He says, he identifies this Nietzschean aphorism where Nietzsche says, it all boils down to this. This is what it all boils down to. Do we sacrifice or don't we? And Nietzsche's answer was, yes, we do sacrifice. So Girard thought this was a very important aphorism because he theorized that Nietzsche basically got sick shortly after this and basically lost his mind. And he felt that Nietzsche gave the wrong answer, even though he identified to say it all boils down to this. Yeah. To say it all boils down to this: do we or don't we sacrifice? That means he had made the discovery. He was the first, according to Girard.
Nietzsche's whole philosophy is based on amor fati, right? Love your fate, and that's the whole thing, right? You just accept it, right?
Yeah. There is all that. So anyway, Girard thought that he was the first to discover it, but that his answer to that question was the wrong answer, and that's why he went mad. That's Girard's theory about Nietzsche, which is a fascinating theory, because had he answered no. So here's the question. It all boils down to this. Do we or don't we sacrifice? Had Nietzsche said the answer to that question is no, then Nietzsche would have had to in order to explain the answer, he would have had to turn around and find the cultural sources of that answer. And he may have found himself dead smack in the middle of the Bible, recognizing that is the actual source of the answer to that question. And then he may have changed his mind on some of his condemnations of Christianity, or at least he would have returned to a new critique of Christianity. Not that he would have rejected what he had already said about Christianity, but that he would have had something new to say about not only Christianity, but the Judaism as well. In other words, he would have recognized more deeply the Bible. Girard thought this was, I don't know if Girard said that. I inferred that from Girard, I think. Anyway, to make a long story short, our culture is rooted. All human culture comes from one linguistic nugget after another, compiled and just forgotten and composted into the underbelly of the human mental experience, which is all. Each and every one of them is an entity of hypocrisy. Mm-hmm. And the only way we know this is because the Bible has shown it to us. Then this is the reason why the Bible is important, because Girard points out that it says it explicitly, and yet it took us 2,000 years to figure it out. Even though when we figure it out, it's completely explicit and obvious. It's like, how come we couldn't figure it out sooner? Why didn't we figure this out 100 years after the Christian Testament was what the Gospels were written? You know, why wasn't it common knowledge in 200 AD instead of 1972 or whatever?
You mean the common knowledge and the message being no, saying no to sacrifice. So
yes, and the answer for Girard is it was so deeply unconscious that even though the wording and the message was completely explicit and completely obvious, it was so deeply unconscious in us that we didn't have the capacity to learn it. Took us 2,000 years to absorb the information to get
Is that what modernity is then? Is that modernity is in a sense denying this whole notion of sacrifice? I mean, it's not there yet, but it's at least, I mean,
I don't want to go into that right away because my answer to that is no. But that will take a long time to explain. Okay. And here's the big argument. This is why Girard is a Christian and why he believes in God. This has to be an intervention. It has to be a force which we just, it took us 2,000 years to figure out what was in fact very explicitly explained. And in a simple language, and what when you figure it out is totally obvious, but yet it is it took us 2,000 years to process it. Now so he's talking about the 2,000 year difference in time is Girard's argument that we have to pay attention to this. He points out that it is explicit, it's simply written, it is it doesn't hide anything, it just says it straight. It shows in full illustration through the story of the trial and execution of Jesus that this is the way we came to be, our human culture came to be, and yet it took us 2,000 years to figure it out, even though it's totally explicit.
So what about other cultures? Like that's true, but there's other cultures that were evolving at the same time as.
He says there are no exception to this particular pagan phenomenon of collective murder.
That's where I object. That's where there's this triumphalism that I feel that is not like, you know, what did the Buddha discover, you know, and what did other cultures discover? What did the Chinese discover? The Taoists discover? What did you know?
I totally agree with those objections, and they're very important objections, but they don't delve into the question of human sacrifice. But they obviously there were other avenues of the improvement of the human condition and arguably full-on spiritualization of humans. That's I don't have any issue with that. But they were different avenues. The dealing with the issue of human sacrifices is one which is the great distinction of the Judeo-Christian cultural vein. Much greater than any other culture. Not that the other cultures don't have. I mean, I'm feel very indebted to Western philosophy, for example, to idealism, to European idealism. But European idealism is not this. This is different. This is the Jewish, the biblical tradition is not the idealist tradition. The biblical tradition delves deep down into the darkest recess of the human cultural mind in order to control and contain something, and so that we don't let this dark force control us over and over again. And it's basically the continuing mimeticist cycle of murder and peace and war and peace, and that just goes on and on and on. We can actually break that cycle. That's what the Bible is basically saying. I'm not saying that meditation and yoga and all these other wonderful traditions aren't. They're different. They're doing different things, but they're not facing head on this problem of collective murder.
But then why is this? Why does this happen in churches over and over? You know, like pedophilia in the Catholic Church, I'm thinking about.
Oh my God! Don't get me going. That's another subject.
Why is it not? It seems to be the same subject. It's like hypocrisy and covering up the lie and this sort of moralism on the surface, and then below the surface, there's some sort of human sacrifice going on.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sexuality is one of the most memeticized subjects. Food, sexuality, because it's so exciting and it's so attached to human desire. It is this subject that has had the most memetic concentration around it. So, in other words, it is the subject that has led to the most collective murders in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's totally charged. The search for innocence is basically, well, here's this is my most general presentation of the Bible. The Bible inhabits a larger metaphor, which is a trial, and we're on trial, and God is the judge. And the simple question is this: this is the trial. Are we innocent? Or are we guilty? Simple.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is the best way. Well, the best way for me, in any case, to frame the Bible is to see it in that very strong, basic moral question: are we innocent, or are we guilty? Now, of course, the answer to that question is always contextual. It's always in every single context in which we're in, and we can identify. I think with every decision we make, we can identify innocence and guilt, and this becomes this very difficult process. And we look at all the details, and we still identify. I identify, at least in many decisions I make, I identify guilt. I identify that there's a degree of wrongness in the decision. There's a degree of rightness,
or maybe ignorance ignorance and understanding, rather than guilt.
I totally agree with you that this is a process of learning. Absolutely. We're digging it up from the unconscious. But the Bible, at least Girard's Bible, says that we are that the main source of our guilt is the deflecting of onto a scapegoat, and how our it basically has created a totally delusional sense of reality.
That's such an important idea, isn't it? It's like
yeah. Basically, all of our language is ultimately illusion. Now we are engaged in a process of sorting it out so that it becomes progressively less illusory. And you asked me about modernity. I would say modernity is part and parcel of that process. Girard, I would not call him. Girard is not a modern thinker. He is what people. I think he calls himself a non-structuralist thinker.
Mm-hmm.
And non-structuralism is, for me, the proper name for what I think is a misnomer, which is what most people call postmodernism. In my opinion, anybody who uses the term postmodernism or post-structuralism, it doesn't understand what they mean. It means it's an immediate indication that they don't understand it. Non-structuralism means that there's a principle which permeates every single category and every single joinery of structure, and it's the same principle. So there's a principle of sameness. Girard has a lot to say about sameness, and so there may not be just one principle. There might be many principles, but all the manyness is a corollary of the one principle, which is related to this whole issue of scapegoating and the negation of scapegoating. History is the process of, or at least Judeo-Christian history is the process of turning that on its head and defending the falsely accused. When we do that, to defend the falsely accused is to look at this objectivity, this great infinitely complex array of objectivity that's before us, and to understand that most of it as false accusation. Everything that we see, our entire understanding of the world, when we look at the sky, when we talk about the stars and the planets and the sun, and talk about people, we talk about history.
So what the future. Illusion or Maya or something? Huh?
Yeah, it's all based on just layers and layers of false accusation and false deified peace related to what the whole cycle of this, what he calls the scapegoat mechanism. And anyway, so when we think that, then we become very skeptical of our sense of objectivity. We become extremely skeptical of it, and we begin to. But we also recognize that we have no choice but to sift through it very, very slowly, knowing even if we sift through it slowly, we're probably going to get it wrong. And so this becomes this whole other thing. And it's not that to be a Jewish believer or a Christian believer, in other words, to be a Jewish theist or a Christian theist, is to understand that divine intervention is engaged in this process of dismantling the false accusation and the false peace.
Why?
Because the word of the Bible, the word of God, is the only tool we have which gave us the ability to understand this. That's why. It's the tool which gave us the understanding of this, which revealed the scapegoat mechanism, and then allowed us to have the ability to defend the innocent victim, which is the absolute. And the innocent victim is not just some person who's alive, who's in your life, but some interpretation of the sky. Well, that whole interpretation of the sky is totally wrong.
So you're just talking about the pursuit of truth, in a sense.
Yes. Well, I'm extrapolating that. I'm taking a leap from defending the witch being burned on the stake to truth claims. When you start to analyze truth claims, you start to recognize that there's a whole bunch of false accusations and finger pointing going on. Something such and such cause. Eggs will cause your heart to if you eat too many eggs, you'll get a bad cholesterol. That these days is thought to be a false accusation. Basically, a false theory is basically, eggs were put on trial and they were found to be guilty of
that's interesting.
giving us poor health. You see, and so now
so maybe it's this human desire to fabricate something, right? It's so powerful in us to make this lie. They make this intense lie about everything, right? Or to believe in concretize something into some truth and you haven't yet really got to the end of it. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Well,
it's a hasty truth. You've got there too early. You haven't
exactly. And everybody, not only that, the whole collective side, the collective murder side, everybody jumps on board. Everybody believes that eggs are bad for your heart. Everybody believes it. And then finally,
medicism. Okay.
And then that's only one example. There's all kinds of examples of this. Now, I'm bringing out science to say that we're still highly mimeticized. And Girard brings up this point. We are still extremely mimeticized, although we're way better than we used to be, and we still got a ways to go. Yeah. And
we're not burning witches most of the time,
Well, Girard's most famous, I believe, one day when he's finally discovered, it's amazing how late he should be world famous. It's just, and I think the reason why he's world famous is because he was a biblical thinker in a time when it wasn't cool to be biblical. That's kind of. It's sad and pathetic, and the reason for this, and Girard was angry about this, is because we are so mimeticized. We were mimeticized to shun biblical scholarship in the mid-20th century. It was considered not to be intelligent. Mm-hmm. So our whole sense of intellectual culture, he points out, is extremely mimeticized. It's not looking in the right places because it's too busy making false accusations off over in some other corner of whatever, instead of actually, identifying the obvious problem. And so this happens all the time.
The next stage of this would be explaining, the negative side of victimology. It's like gone the other way, right?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
People are starting to think that that people are taking that on as they are the innocent victim, to extreme extents, right?
Yeah. Well, just before I get on, I thought of one. Before I talk about that, I thought about what I wanted to say. Girard made this statement, which I believe one day will be a very famous statement. There are famous statements in intellectual history. I think, therefore, I am. There's a few others. I can't think of them at the moment. There's a few. God is dead. And also in literature, to be or not to be. That was the question. There's a few really famous phrases that are, they're not going anywhere. And Girard said this. He said, "We did not stop burning witches because science was invented. Rather, science was invented because we stopped burning the witches." Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. to me, that he just nails it with that one. Totally nails it. And he identifies. There's this great sense in Western intellectual history that we were mired in the delusions, the stupid delusions of religion. And then along came science and showed us how delusional religion was. And now we are sort of, our minds are clarifying and things are getting better. And, you know, the Enlightenment happened. And thank God we're out of that miry religious hole. And Girard says, you foolish dummies. That's not what happened. What happened was, it took us friggin' 1,500 years or 1,400 years to recognize that burning witches was bad. And here's an interesting take on witch burnings of the Middle Ages. Witch burnings happen in the Middle Ages, and we look at the witch burnings as being as a dark period of Western European history, because we were burning witches for a couple hundred years or something like that. Here's what really happened, and it did happen, and it was something dark and terrible, but that's not what happened. We were doing something similar to that all along. There were, you know, in the time of Jesus, there were crucifixions. That was very common. There were other forms of lynchings happening right up through the Dark Ages. But what happened with the witch burnings, and I didn't bring this up, I didn't stress this enough when I talked about collective murder. The trial, the condemnation of the accused person is always unanimous in the trial, going back in prehistory. Yeah. But with the witch burnings, there were people in the crowd who disagreed with what was happening. Uh-huh. And that didn't happen before? That did not happen before. It was unanimous. That's why it isn't in the history book.
I was wondering about the guillotines, because I know in Paris there you know, people would line up to watch this stuff. It was a show, you know, and that's 1789.
Yeah, it is amazing how late we are.
People would there was just, you know, they had to, the neighbors were complaining because there were so many guillotines going along. It's a bit noisy, but then the crowds were all getting, you know, they would come out and watch this, and it would be, you know, Sunday entertainment or.
Yeah, it's just crazy. Just nuts. So, yeah. It's really disturbing to think about it. But we know that was wrong, and I think the reason why we know that was wrong is because there were people at the event who knew it was wrong. Uh-huh.
Well, weren't there always people that would know something like that would be wrong? I mean,
no, going back in time, Girard makes the point that the guilty verdict was unanimous, and the movement away from the unanimity of the guilty verdict, it was very slow, and in fact required nothing less than divine intervention.
Is that because people were just one collective mind? They hadn't individuated yet. They hadn't become beings.
That would be one way.
Beings who could think from themselves, or
this is definitely one definition of individuation. Yeah, this is one source of individuation for sure. I agree. I would think. I mean, the whole idealism, what the Greeks get on with, there seems to be. I think. Well, we get it. It gets murkier here now. My argument gets really difficult here now. But you know, Nietzsche talks about this master and slave moralities. That's where I think Nietzsche is really important. It's funny whenever I hear people talk about Nietzsche, I never hear them talk much about the slave and master and slave. That to me is Nietzsche's great. They talk about all kinds of other stuff. They talk about, I don't know, the will to power or something. The master and slave, his recognition of the master and the slave and how they evolved, and how we're at a period of history where they're coming together. That was Nietzsche's great theory, that the master and the slave evolved as separate culture, separate moralities, separate cultures, separate from each other, as distinct from each other. And this went on for a very long time. And this is basically prehistory developing this. And then basically, especially in the time of Nietzsche, they were coming together. And this was a problem. Nietzsche saw many problems with this, but also recognized that that's what was going on. That seems to me his great theoretical import. All the other stuff he's talking about is extraneous to that particular insight.
Well, it's part of the same insight as God is dead, isn't it? I mean, it means that there's nobody above you and nobody, you know, anymore. It's like people are leveling out. So
So
we don't think of human beings as having a higher. They're being higher human beings than other human beings. They're just richer or poorer,
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. Anyway, why did I bring up Nietzsche? Oh yes. So the master and the slave. I think the Plato and Aristotle, they and ancient Greek philosophy and ancient Greek culture, period, what has survived to enrich us, is derivative of master culture. And so they were articulating and they were clarifying and working on and making and basically a language which was derivative of master culture, and they were creating a philosophy out of that and a sense of reality and the view of the universe and all of that, all through the eyes of master culture. While Judaism is right down in the muck of slave culture and articulating. It still has a master dimension, but it's working on this scapegoat thing. It's working on this deep dark origin of culture, which and it's deeply rooted in what Nietzsche
it's about freeing the people, isn't it, and finding a nation and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
But it's really rooted right down in the it's right down in the bottom of right in the bedrock of culture. While there's something about the Greeks, which is this, they're up in the sky. They're gods. They're different altogether. Mm-hmm. They're so that's a really interesting thing about the Jewish import. And what I'm really talking about here is Judaism, although I'm talking about it through the eyes of the Gospels, through the lens of the Gospels. Mm-hmm. I've recently kind of developed an elaborate theory of anti-Semitism, which I'm kind of proud of, but I'm going to cut right down to I'm going to simplify it. And
maybe we should make another video about that, because
it's maybe I won't simplify it. Let's go through it very quickly. Thomas Sowell talks about the middleman. We've come to see Jews as associated with money and all things good and bad about money. This is a latter day cultural development. And I think it's a result of the deprivation of private property back because of Christian persecution. Not that I know, I'm not much of an historian, but basically what they developed was the culture of the middleman. Now the middleman, as to put it in Thomas Sowell's words, is a very badly misunderstood figure. The middlemen are basically essential to economics. Mm-hmm. So they basically buy and sell. And if there's nobody out there buying and selling, then you don't have a very functional economy. So these people are necessary, and so and the middleman. It's very common for the middleman in many cultures to be resented and to be blamed and to be thought that they're being that whoever the middleman is cheating them of something. And maybe at times they are, maybe at other times they're not. But the truth is, they're necessary. So whether like it or not, they're there. Now, competition between middlemen brings down the dishonesty. You get a much better deal when there's competition. Like in Newfoundland, we had what we called the merchant economy here, and merchants. This theory developed, and I'm starting to realize it's a result of the onslaught of Marxist culture into Western economic theory. Where we recognize the merchants as these terrible people who cheated out the fisher folk of Newfoundland. I think we might want to have a second look at that history. I think that might be a very skewed. Not that there isn't some truth to it, but I've been thinking about the Newfoundland folk songs, and there's not a lot of Newfoundland folk songs which hates the merchant. It seems like it's a relatively recent introduction. We were taught by theory, it seems, to hate the merchants. While it seems at one time it was understood to be a just a necessary part of life. It was a piece of the puzzle, right? A piece of the larger fabric that without which you could not survive, kind of thing. A bit like a king. A king is both worshipped and reviled depending on the king, depending on the cultures, something like that. So anyway, middleman and middleman cultures are often persecuted and often reviled. The Armenians were middlemen, for example. They suffered persecution. There were other middlemen in Eastern Africa. Thomas Sowell talks about, and there's another middleman culture he mentions. I forget now, but basically there are several cultures which are middleman cultures, which end up being persecuted, being suspected of cheating and this kind of thing. So it's a common thing, and yet the middleman is a necessary piece of the puzzle. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's. But I think this is an important reason for anti-Semitism. But
it's
only the
useful
beginning.
Scapegoat again, going back to Girard.
That's right. That's only the beginning. The second reason is, I think, far more important than the first. I'm thinking in terms of three reasons. The third reason is the most important. The second reason has to do with the fall of Rome. What happened was Rome fell, and basically Europe became overrun by what I call, for provocation, but also out of seriousness, the Catholic Taliban. The Catholic Taliban basically took over all of Europe.
Right.
That's basically what
the Inquisition, was. Right? That's the Inquisition.
No. You're talking the Dark Ages. Inquisition.
Oh, okay, that's something else.
Yeah,
okay.
Dark Ages. Dark Ages was a time of, and a lot of people don't know this. This is something I only learned recently. Shortly after the fall of Rome, the Muslim world attacked and advanced and took much of Christendom from Christendom. Christendom had extended down into the Middle East, and was it was fairly large, and then the Muslim world began to infringe upon Christendom, and it took over vast amounts of territory, and this went on. This advancement continued for 400 years. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know this, but it basically, the entire Dark Ages is characterized by war with the Muslim world, and the Muslim world was the aggressor. And the Catholic Europe was basically it seems to me, basically a place which forever was reeling from the fall of Rome. In other words, it was sub-civilizational place,
because it was cut off from the power of Rome, sort of thing. It had been isolated, or
well, it basically didn't have a civilization to hold it together. It was no longer a civilization. It seems it was just a disparate. I don't know what it was. It seems, but in some strange way, it remained a Catholic entity, a Christian entity. But despite the fact that for 400 years it was at war with Islam, essentially, and about 400 years later, 900 or something, they finally started to push back the Muslim world. I don't know if the Crusades have anything. The Crusades were later, a couple of centuries later. I don't know if they're related, but I mean, some people think of it as blowback, but I don't know. I don't know if it is.
But what about anyway? Go back to the
here's the thing.
What you call the Catholic Taliban?
Yeah. Here's the thing. So the Catholic Europe is at war, has basically imposed a Christendom over Europe. It's at war with the Muslim world, but the Jews aren't Christians. And not only that, this Europe at the time is a theocracy. There is no separation of state and religion. It is religion that reigns. And this is another theory I've derived from thinking about this, is that when religion is a sub level, is a level below secularity. It's a level below the imperial realm. So when the empire falls, when civilization falls, what you have is religion, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, I'm a defender of religion, but a religion without the upper level, that's kind of, it's basically the Taliban. It's something. In other words, some kind of mixture of gangsterism and religion will reign over the land in a place where civilization collapses. And so that's my understanding of what happened in the Dark Ages in Europe. However, the Jews remained a distinct group. They would not pledge allegiance to Christianity, would not say that they are Christians. And what that amounts to in a theocracy is treason. It doesn't just amount to heresy or some other form of religious. It's not a religious act to not pledge allegiance to another religion in a theocracy. It's also an act of treason, because you are not, in a sense, pledging allegiance to the governing force.
Well, it's kind of like the Christians now in the Muslim world, maybe, you know. I mean, in some
like
of the more theocratic Muslim countries, and the Christians who are stuck there being persecuted.
Well, this is why the separation of state and religion is so important, because in a state which is identical with religion, then to not espouse that particular religion is to be against the government of that land, and that's the governing force, and that's treason. And they did that for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. Now, it's amazing that they did that. They managed to swing that, and I'm sure that they did it for providential reasons. You know, they couldn't give up their Jewish identity for deeper reasons than.
Well, the Jews are survivors.
Yeah, but nonetheless, to not see this, not understand this in that context as treason is. And to not, and to see that this went on for a very long time, and to accuse Christianity of just simply bigotry or something based on this is not quite right, because it is quite possible that they could have been allies with the Muslim invaders, for example. It's more than possible, because they weren't friends with the Christians, if you see it from that perspective. And so they, in other words, if you're not with us, then you may well be with them, and that's that. And let's not forget, it was 400 years of war. So I'm thinking that there's this may well be an extremely important source of anti-Semitism, which, because it went on for so long, because this period
went entrenched in people's.
It's just totally entrenched in you know, Catholicism still maintained sovereignty until the modern age arrived, until the nation state sort of started to upend it. So in other words, there was still this sense of you know, there was not much separation between state and religion until the modern times, until the rise of the nation state.
But doesn't it go back to Jesus and Paul and all of that? I mean, Paul, I don't know.
No, I haven't gotten there. That's the second cause. So I just described here's another thing. So I just talked about sovereignty, basically. I just talked about the fusion of state and religion, and that means that religion is identical in a theocracy with the sovereign state. A lot of people don't realize this. Property is simply an attribute, it's a subcategory of sovereignty. Mm-hmm. When you organize the territory, the land, the kingdom, in terms of its property, you're mapping out all this property. Some of it may be private property, sure, but you're still mapping it out from a perspective of sovereignty, and also from a perspective of taxation. Denying Jews property would have had to do with sovereignty, because after all, they were treasonous, ultimately treasonous. If you see what I mean, it means they weren't. To be denied property is it means you're not a full member of the state. That's what that means. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm getting at? Mm-hmm. So this is all a function of this second reason I'm talking about, this denial of property and the entrenchment of anti-Semitism due to its relationship to sovereignty, to treason, to the fact that if you're not with us, you're against us in this very difficult time of maintaining the sovereignty of the land and of Christianity, which was identical with the state. See what I'm getting at? So that's the denying of property.
What I want to go to is the level deeper, where Jacob and Esau are at war even in the womb, right? This is what Rabbi Yaakov keeps talking about. This like they were at war in the womb already of Sarah.
Well, you said something to me already about Yaakov Levitz, and we agreed completely. So here's the third reason. It's by far the most important reason. The Jews had, for reasons I don't fully understand, developed a strong antipathy, and they felt it was their divine providence to oppose human sacrifice. So there was a deep cultural commitment inside Judaism. It was
That's true.
usually
Yeah.
usually a part of their identity to oppose human sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
It was a deep and so they identified themselves as anti-pagan. That's fundamental to their identity, is to not be.
And
we are not pagan.
Paul invited the Gentiles into the church, right?
Yeah, that's right. So along comes the Gospels, and what they do is they portray a human sacrifice. They portray someone being executed and tried and executed, mistried and executed for all the wrong reasons. It's a totally insane trial and execution. The Jews look at that and they say, that is a human sacrifice. We got nothing to do with that. That's pagan shit, man. We're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere near it. That's not Jewish. When in fact, what that was is it was indeed a human sacrifice. It was indeed a journey right down into the heart of the pagan mindset, and yet it went down in it penetrated right into the heart of the pagan mindset with Jewish cultural insight, with Jewish cultural import. Mm-hmm. So it was in fact Jewish. All of the insights which show that this is wrong, that this has to be dismantled, was information that was already contained in the Jewish Testament.
Right, and of course Jesus was a Jewish rabbi, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that too. So in other words, but so what happened? And in fact, the fact that this great Jewish insight penetrated right down into the heart of paganism, that is what made this particular portrayal of collective murder, of human sacrifice, the most powerful story that had ever been written about a human sacrifice, about a collective murder. And that the power of that story is what attracted the pagan audience in much greater numbers than ever before. There had been numerous stories about sacrifices.
Oh, right.
It's just that they weren't worth shit. They would dwindle and die. They were because there were dime a dozen, in fact. And but this one had a crazy amount of power, and the reason was because of the Jewish import that gave it all the power. And the power was to dismantle it, in fact, to negate it. The pagans' audience was magnetically drawn to this, and it brought it down.
That's Girard's theory, right? It's the sacrifice to end sacrifice.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
He's actually more he's more careful about that. He's much more. This is why I think of him as a Jewish thinker. He doesn't say it's a sacrifice to end all sacrifice, even though that's a very interpretation to make, and that's the common Christian. I think that would probably be a more traditional Catholic argument. The sacrifice to end all sacrifices, but he says no. It was actually just a mistrial. It's actually just wrong. So he's kind of Jewish in that he goes right down there with this Jewish insight and says it's actually just a bunch of bullshit. And but yet it was a divine intervention to really reveal it all to be a bullshit. So he doesn't like the preordained sacrificial mission of Jesus to go down there and be killed. He knew it was going to happen. Yeah, and, he strays away from that. He doesn't like it. He thinks that lends itself to sacrificial. One of his biggest ideas was that religion needed to be desacralized, and Christianity in particular needed to be desacralized. He, I think, changed his mind at the very end of his life.
Oh, I want to object to that, but
he changed his mind at the very end of his life. He had an insight at the very end in the last few years. It's in his interview in with David Cayley. He says, only very recently, he said, have I learned this, have I discovered this, that sacrifice has two meanings. So he had basically devoted his entire intellectual career to one particular meaning of sacrifice, which basically is the type of sacrifice which is horrific and needed to be negated, needed to be stopped.
And then the other kind is the kind that Jordan Peterson talks about, maybe.
There's another kind, and
giving up something for the future, or
it's complex and
related to.
I think it has to do. My take on it. I never journeyed into what Girard had to say about it. I'm not sure he had much to say about it. He was he was done by then, I think. But my take is just synonymous with existentialism. with every decision you make, you are omitting a million, an infinite number of other decisions. I'm drinking a glass of water here, which means I'm not drinking orange juice, or means I'm not, I'm holding this glass instead of holding my phone. I mean, with every even the tiniest decisions made, you are omitting every other decision that can be possibly made. I'm chatting with you while I could be out,
Could be out scoring babes.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say something more vulgar, but you said it better. You said the same thing. You anticipated what I was going to say. So that's but I don't know. That's one definition of sacrifice, the positive definition. In other words, that's we are our daily, our minute by minute life is fundamentally sacrificial.
Yeah.
But there's a whole other where this impulse to blame. He sees that we absolutely have to extricate
that's good. That's good that we're separating those two definitions.
Yeah, we absolutely have to extricate blame and leave it and contain it. All forms of blame. He basically, I think he thinks that all forms of blame are there's basically ultimately no one. I think it's a radical. He's radically moving us towards a blameless. Although, I mean, it's hard to say. Like, he thinks, for example, Nietzsche in many ways was the godfather of Nazism. He says that in that essay about in his final book, which is a pretty strong thing to say, and that's kind of like a blame. So maybe he does reserve some blame. I don't know. Where was I? Oh yes. So the only reason the story of the crucifixion, the Christian Passion, is so enormously powerful is because of the insertion of Jewish anti-sacrificial, Jewish desacralizing power right down into the core recurring identity of paganism, which is human sacrifice, the collective murder. The pagans look at this and they're totally drawn to it because, first of all, they're drawn to collective murder anyway. They're drawn to human sacrifice. That's their natural religious magnetic draw. And then they are witnessing all this information that they never heard before, they never saw before. And it's just this explosion of this massive learning curve, right, for the pagans. But the problem with that is it mimeticized it at the same time. What happens is pagan culture, which would have been like a big ocean surrounding the Jewish identity, completely floods and inundates the Christian Passion story, and then owns it as its own. Mm-hmm. And so after a very short time, the birth of Christianity is ultimately Jewish, and very, very shortly after thereafter, it is
something
colonized.
Else.
It is owned by a pagan identity, and what happens is the Jewish seed only very, very slowly grows inside that pagan identity.
What happens is Rome, imperial Rome. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Christianity was only adopted as the official religion late in Rome. I don't know what was before, but yeah, it slowly grew.
Symbolically speaking, right?
Yeah. And so that's that. But here's the thing: the pagan flood combined with the flood of that and embracement of that, the Christian Passion, combined with the Jewish reaction and being repelled from the Christian Passion on the grounds that it is human sacrifice. One is repelled, one rejects it, the other embraces it, and yet it is fundamentally Jewish. Mm-hmm. So there's this totally bizarre contradiction at work. And so what happens is this pagan flood adopts this totally Jewish identity, very close to the Jewish identity, and yet the Jewish identity rejects it. Right there.
Yeah.
These are way greater numbers than the Jewish identity, the reactionary Jew, mm-hmm. and so it's right at the birthplace in many ways of Christianity that anti-Semitism is born, mm-hmm. and that's both a.
Bard was talking about and
a beautiful thing to hear.
The Jews being the representing the idea of the nation state, right? The state of Israel, And Christianity has a kind of universal theme, and Judaism has a theme of nationalism or something, or nation. That's not Bart. That's me paraphrasing, or
yeah.
I'm not sure if I've got that right.
I heard Bart talk a little bit about that. It's true that there's a universalism in Christianity. I would back away. I mean, there's a whole ultra conservative, what do they call them? Ultra orthodox Jewish people who think that nationhood and Judaism are contradictory to each other. And that's my understanding of Judaism as well. And so there's something about, and the reason is Judaism, the nation is ultimately synonymous with the tribal identity and the nation state. And the tribal identity, I didn't get into this with Girard, but the tribal identity is a product of pockets of culture which are created through cycles of mimeticism and scapegoating, the collective murder, which creates this distinct.
But the nation is bigger than the tribe. It's a collection of tribes, under.
The nation state eventually emerged institutionally much later. I mean, it's only a few years old.
Right.
I think my understanding of the nation state is that it is fundamentally sacrificial in the negative sense. It grew out of murder, even though there are positive ideals at work too. It's my feeling is that Israel is an imitation of the Christian creation of the nation state. In other words, England, France, all these European countries and small ones too. That Israel imitated that, and that really Israel, in my view about Israel is that I don't take Zionism very seriously. I don't think Zionism is seriously central to Israel, although it has become increasingly so. I think the Holocaust is far and away the most identifying force, the most important force that is fueled Israeli identity. In other words, I think the word Israel is almost a synonym of never again. That's how I think of Israel. And the reason for the intensity around Israeli identity is it's certainly not clear that it will be never again. And at least in my view, there still is teeming under the surface of Western identity, anti-Semitism.
Oh yeah, it's coming up a bit. It seems to be. It's a strange thing. I find it very strange.
Yeah,
I see you get little hits of anti-Semitism here and there. Somebody said something on Facebook, or it's like you feel it kind of bubbling to the surface all over again.
I think if you understand Girard's theory completely, it becomes obvious why it's there. And I think Jewish culture, because of its deep sensitivity to this scapegoat thing, is Christianity has.
The thing is, the term anti-Semitism is a watered down version of what it really is, which is, Rabbi Jacob would say Jew hate, right? Hatred.
Yeah.
So why do we say anti-Semitism as if it's? Why don't we just say hatred of Jews? That would make it more direct, as being what it is, right?
Yeah.
Then we would know what it is rather than this thing. Oh, what's anti-Semitism?
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah, I mean the Semites. I mean the Arabs are Semites, right?
Yeah.
So this is kind of a strange word to be using, Semite. Anyway, so what was I going to say? The Israel will lose its sense of urgent identity, will diminish only when it has confidence that anti-Jewish sentiment is something that has
been contained or has been
properly contained, and it hasn't been.
Mm-hmm.
So that is the reason I've often thought, why can't they figure out the fucking Palestine problem? Because Palestine, actually, my understanding is they have a fairly reasonable request. They've said that they have their traditional land, and it's only a small part of Israel. It's the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and And why? And this was back in the PLO days with Yasser Arafat. And so that was their demand. And so if you just give us the West Bank and the Gaza, and we'll leave you alone, and we won't, we can have two countries. And I thought to myself, well, geez, why don't they fucking agree to that? Yeah. And after all, Israel's a tiny place anyway. Well, it's in many ways just a symbolic. It's a symbolic center of Jewish culture. It's too small for all of them to live there. But the answer is what I just gave. The reason why it will never really be fully resolved, and that there's this sense of enlarging territory there and stuff, is because never again is not a given. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely not a given. And the more the West falls into turmoil, the more you will have the tendency for anti-Semitism to rise. René Girard explains, it is that very dismantling of the nugget, that deep dark knot, which is the of human hypocrisy, which keeps us mired in an endless cycle of illusion. So what you look at anything, and you look at any thought, any feeling that's in your mind, and you look at any theory out there, any ideology, and you say to yourself, is this in the business of victimizing? And then you analyze it, and what you're engaged in is this process of absolution, basically, is the proper verb.
Yeah, right.
Or
just unveiling layer upon layer of illusion until you get it something more true. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And usually the process, I love the word absolution, because I think the absolution the Catholic sacrament of absolution means the bringing together of understanding and forgiveness. The word to be absolved, it implies those two things, understanding and forgiveness. So the whole process of defending the innocent victim is really it's a gentle but firm process, gentle and strong. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't accuse. It's not in the business of accusing, and because it recognizes that you're caught up in the usual cycle.
Caught up in the game. If you're accusing, if you're in a state of accusing, you're caught up in the same old game. You haven't gotten out of the trap.
That's right. And he did warm. He saw it in his last book, I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, which, by the way, is a quote from the Gospels. He saw the rise of what he called victimology, and he knew that this was an absolutely wretched development. It's hard to articulate. I can't remember what he said about it exactly, but I only this week I thought of how to articulate. First of all, when you're embellishing your own victimage, there's usually an accusation engaged in that. You're accusing someone else, and that usually the accusation is false. That's part of it. But another part is to bring on too much attention to a certain form of victimage, which may indeed be legitimate, is possibly to obscure a much greater victimization of another. And so you're overstating. If you're overstating a certain victimization, mm-hmm. then you are obscuring other more important victimization. More importantly, I find it deeply tragic that René Girard is not more well known, because there seems to be a gravitation. We're getting closer and closer to understanding his very point, the whole point of scapegoating and the whole point of victimizing, but we're not there. And so when the closer you get to it, the more intense the feelings become, because it actually is this deep knot of memeticism that we're about to unravel.
It's hard to lay down your sword, or
yes, exactly,
whatever it happens to be, right? Like
you can feel we're getting closer to this deep source of terrible cultural origin, which is very much a part of us, and it is fundamentally violent, and it is laden with mimetic intensity. So everybody is in this hurry to imitate and to belong, and at the same time they're aware that something's going to blow, and and who's going to be the victim, kind of who's going to be the scapegoat, and who there's this, and at the same time, it seems to me we're getting damn close to just dismantling it.
Okay.
And the word, I love the word absolution. There's something about it. It's the combination of understanding and forgiveness. So when you get a sense of, whenever people start, I mean, I've found it's very easy to get wrapped up into it. It's almost, in many ways, it's almost impossible because it's so fundamental to us to not be mimeticist. We fall victim to it all the time. And René Girard was fairly aware of that he himself was subject to mimeticism. He knew that he quite possibly could be saying mimetic things and, pointing the finger and making false accusations. He was very aware of that. It was kind of fascinating to watch him be so careful and so aware of the possibility for sin. It's kind of it's an amazing theory.
That's another. I guess it could be a definition of sin too, right?
Oh my God, yes!
You just mentioned the word sin, so I thought, yeah, that's what sin is. It's being untruthful, right? It's missing the mark. It's
absolutely.
It's pointing fingers at innocent people, and to avoid your own existential business.
Yeah. Absolutely. Take the log out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of another. I've been thinking a lot about sin this past couple of weeks. Sin, it's like there's the extremely famous line of Jesus on the cross: "Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do." Girard proposes that this is in fact the very first mention of the unconscious. This has no precedent. He thinks
I see what you mean.
He may be wrong, but he suggests that the very first mention of the unconscious is right there. Forgive them, Lord, for they know not what they do. The problem with not knowing what you do is it's hard to call it sin if you know not what you do. But it seems to me that
when you know what you do, then it's sin. Yeah. When
yes.
You do,
so in other words,
there's a little bit like if you're halfway to knowing, or
that's right. So it seems to me we are engaged in a progressive. We are engaged in a progression towards sin. In other words, sin is a very enlightened term because we are becoming progressively aware of it. Now I know it can be corrupted. I mean, part of the 20th century, like Nietzsche said, be more sinful. He wrote he was being ironic. He was taking a shot at Christian moralism.
At the shallow morality, right?
Yeah.
The whole business.
So obviously there are humps in the ladder, but nonetheless, I think this word sin is this marvelous march towards freedom. In fact, because the more and more you are aware of sin, the more free you are, and the more even if you sin, if you become. You're free because you are aware that you are sinning, or to be aware of sin is also to be more capable of avoiding it. So that's a good thing too, of course. That's the best thing. But if you sin and know you're sinning, you're exercising freedom. You're aware of your freedom. So it's a march toward freedom as well.
That's great. Yeah. I like that.
So it's a kind of a fascinating thing. Whereas back in the time of the crucifixion of Jesus, arguably. This doesn't count as sin. This is kind of a fascinating.
Yeah. What doesn't count as sin is because there's nobody doing it. It's just a collective momentum.
Yeah. There you have it.